be voting for this bill.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the Honourable Minister, Nikki Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's very interesting to listen to Kennedy Graham talking about the Sustainable Biofuels Bill, because I was part of that small select committee. In fact, I did chair it. And I reflect on the excitement that people concerned about the environment were with the ideas of biofuels. It seemed to answer the twin problems of long-term sourcing of fossil fuels and a way to cut carbon emissions in the face of climate change. As someone who's particularly interested in waste minimisation and recycling, there was also lots of exciting ideas of new technologies to turn waste products into energy sources. Many countries embraced the development of biofuels. Some introduced subsidies to encourage the growth of biofuel feedstock, and some even passed laws to mandate the supply of biofuels. In fact, in 2008, Labor passed the Biofuel Bill, which placed an obligation on oil companies to sell biofuels as a set percentage of their sales. Now, biofuels can be made from a variety of biofuel feedstocks, including grain, palm oil, oil crops such as rape and woody growth. And biofuels can also be made from some waste products, and the example that we see mostly in New Zealand is used cooking oil or food waste such as tallow. There's been ongoing experiments in New Zealand concerning the growth of algae and very fast-growing feedstock in nutrient-rich environments. And those experiments have been happening in the Blenheim sewage plant. And although that work looks promising, and they're working in partnership with some people in the US, it hasn't been commercialised yet. And that's one of the problems. Yes, we can use waste to make biofuels, but to get any economy of scale, specific crops need to be grown. As the world learned more about biofuels, we learnt that not all biofuels were good for the environment. We learnt that the cultivation and the growth of some crops used for biofuels, when we analysed their life cycles, were enormously hungry on fossil fuels during the growing process, so they did very little to lower carbon emissions. And then we discovered that by subsidising the growing of crops, many farmers changed from growing food crops to growing fuel crops. And the classic example there was the growing of grains in the US. The prices that grain farmers could get with the subsidy forced up the cost of food, and many low-income people couldn't afford to buy the foods that they had always relied on. In fact, the cost of tortillas in Mexico went up because of the US government subsidy for biofuels. And finally, we discovered that when encouraged by a government subsidy, there was a loss of important biodiversity, the clear felling of indigenous forests, and the destruction of valuable ecosystems to grow biofuel stocks, particularly palm oil. So the excitement about biofuels was tempered by these three major problems, and finally, that we needed too much fossil fuel to grow some crops. So, firstly, the problem was that we needed too much fossil fuel to grow the crops. Secondly, that growing biofuel stocks deprive people of food that they could not afford. And thirdly, that in some cases we were destroying the very environment we were looking to save by clearing land for a growing feedstock. So much so that environmentalists became increasingly disappointed and worried about the consequences of increased biofuel production. They felt that subsidising biofuels or placing an obligation on the sale of biofuels, such as Labor's bill was doing in this country, would actually cause environmental damage. In New Zealand, Jan Wright, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, was so concerned that she did an inquiry and wrote a report saying, "The biofuel bill currently before Parliament should not proceed in its current form. International concern about the sustainability of biofuels and their true environmental and economic impacts have heated up considerably in recent months, which signals a need for caution." and Jeanette Fitzsimons, co-leader of the Greens at the time, introduced this bill. This bill was designed to ensure that biofuels imported into New Zealand to meet the obligation would need to pass a sustainability test, so that we would not be buying biofuels that could be doing environmental and social damage. In 2009, the National Government repealed the Biofuel Bill and the obligation for all companies to sell a percentage of biofuels. We repealed the Act in face of these sustainability issues and because we believed it would force up the price of fuel for consumers. Existing biofuel production continued, but it was from local feedstock and mostly waste products such as used cooking oil and tallow. When the Sustainable Biofuels Bill came to Select Committee and we heard the submissions on the bill, we concluded that the bill was unnecessary and impractical for several reasons. First, there was no available international standard by which to judge whether biofuels were sustainable or not. Secondly, as National had repealed the biofuels obligation, there was no pressure to import unsustainable biofuels. The amount of biofuels being used in the country was low and mostly made in New Zealand. All of New Zealand-made biofuels were made from waste products. As I've said, used cooking oil, tallow, whey, or non-edible seeds such as rape. Although there were small amounts of Brazilian sugarcane being imported, the sugarcane was sustainable. The biofuel industry had a voluntary reporting scheme. Its argument was that people who were buying biofuels were doing it to show their environmental credentials and that the use of unsustainable biofuels would threaten that. So companies were very careful the sources of their biofuels. And finally, that we could already make regulations to cover any problems. Section 35 and 36 of the Energy Fuels Levies Act 1989 included regulation making an information gathering powers regarding producers and suppliers of engine fuel, and these sections could be modified to discourage unsustainable biofuels in New Zealand if it was necessary in the future. And finally, we couldn't find any evidence of immediate concern of unsustainable biofuels being sold in New Zealand. We were pleased that the biofuel industry appeared to appreciate the importance of environmental sustainability, and that was part of people's motivation for using biofuels. So we decided to recommend that the bill did not proceed. I, like Jeanette Fitzsimons and so many others, was hopeful that biofuels could provide an answer to sourcing fossil fuels and cutting carbon emissions. But it seems that using sustainable biofuels is a bigger challenge than we first thought. I'm still hopeful that biofuels made from waste products will become much more viable and useful in the future. I thank Jeanette Fitzsimons for this bill. It was an attempt to mitigate the environmental hazards of biofuels when we thought we would have an obligation in New Zealand, but as time has passed, it has proved to be unnecessary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Moana Maki.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.